What's going on, everybody? Zach here for another glass blowing demo. Today we're building this two-piece Sherlock, silver fume, chromium, and some galaxy lip wraps on there. I've sped most of this up to 4 times. This is a little bit of a different camera angle than some of my other videos. This time I actually am re-editing a live that I did a week ago. I thought it would be good to cut it down and make it a little bit more of a tutorial, explain what I was doing, and even answer some of the questions that I didn't get to during the live chat. So I'm going to do my best to answer those while we put this thing together. So each one of these sections is a little implosion bubble. I've blown it out thin and then put some dots and lines, swirls and stuff onto each piece so that I could build the pattern and then stack them up with the little lip wraps of galaxy in between. So right now we're just starting that first bubble, gonna melt that in. We're trying to puff this out to get nice even walls because we're gonna pull this out to be the mouthpiece. And when you do the bend, having a nice even tube is very important to getting a nice consistent bend. And just a couple puffs, get that out to the diameter we want. Then I can get that handle off of there. Now we'll puff that little section out to match the other piece. Open a hole up and get ready for the next bubble. There we go, puffing out a little blister. Just try to thin that. I don't often blow that out until I get a bunch of bubble trash like that. Just careful to melt it back in. Now we're just skinning that away because a little bit of that glass gets boiled when it's so thin. It's really easy to overheat, so you definitely want to clean it up before you join the next bubble. If you do any of that, having the nice clean bunch of glass on the ring seal that you're putting together is super important. If you've got any boiled glass, it's often a spot where you can see a imperfection in the Incalmo kind of line. As you condense, you'll see this little spot where the glass was boiled. But I'm just going to use my octagonal reamer. I'm always trying to get on the underside of that lip, kind of to lift the inside of the tubing outwards so that I don't condense back that little line of color that we use as the lip wrap to separate each section. If you heat up too much and just force the glass backwards by pushing on the outer lip too much, it'll kind of smear that lip wrap backwards and you end up with a less clean line, a little bit more of a wavy effect. There we go, almost to the diameter we're looking for. That's going to be the last puff, and now we're going to start stretching this out. Like I said before, this is the mouthpiece half of the pipe, so I want to get a nice even taper from one end to the other, and then give it a nice bend. So there we're pulling out the larger end first, and then the end attached to the blow tube will be the mouthpiece, so that'll taper down to a nice narrow section. There, getting a good look at that now. So there we're working the heat into the mouthpiece, pulling it out. You can see there's a bit of a knuckle right in between where the color and the lip wrap go to the clear. The color and the clear section will pull a little bit differently, so kind of going back in and working that section in a little bit to make the two halves transition to each other a little bit better is important. The clear just wants to flow a little bit easier than the color. So here we are, almost done working that in. I'm condensing a little bit of that clear back that had been stretched out. We're looking pretty close to what we want. Now the process of warming the whole blank up so that we can make that nice even bend starts. And at this point, you really want to heat up almost the entire piece. Trying to bend this in multiple bends is really difficult. Heating up more glass than you want to bend is essential so that you don't get any weird kinks in the tube. And I'm just kind of trying to make a smiley face kind of shape. You're letting it droop. I try not to do the bend in the other direction. I like to let that hang. And we'll pull that handle away. Pick away that scrap glass that we don't want from the handle. And now I'm going to heat up that whole bottom so that I can let that end kind of condense a little bit, and then I'll use gravity to carefully let it droop towards the side that the bend is at. I just wanted the bottom, the fatter end, to kind of continue that bend just the way the rest of it was. I didn't heat up quite as much as I wanted on that side, so continuing the bend a little bit, but very carefully, and just using gravity was what I wanted to do. So now we're gonna work on a implosion here. This is a section of silver fume. I didn't have everything prepped up. I think I had 2 more of these to do, and I ended up doing them on the live. I had, I think, 7 sections that I stacked up for this piece, and most of them I had prepped beforehand. But here you see I grabbed this, I believe it's a 3mm rod, and make a nice big swirl. The 3mm rod's good for doing these swirling kind of spiral patterns. It melts in really quickly, and then I can use it for some of the dots as well. I do end up picking up a 7mm rod. The 7mm rod just lets me kind of like fill in a little more glass a little faster. One of the questions that came in during the live chat was why I switched. So that's pretty much it. Just kind of like trying to fill in a little more space, get a little bit of variety from the dots and lines, having some smaller ones and larger ones next to each other. It just displaces the glass in different ways, so it gives the pattern a little bit more variation. So another one of the comments I got was asking how to get good blue colors out of silver fume, and really like trying to avoid any kind of creamy colors is all about flame chemistry. You really want to avoid having too much propane in the flame, and then the secondary thing is kind of not overheating it. So I always fume inside my blanks, close them up, and then put my patterns on from the outside. This allows the silver to be protected inside the clear, and you don't really have to worry quite as much about the flame chemistry to preserve the colors of the patterns. There you can see that, all the dots and lines starting to melt in nicely. Something I actually have started doing with my dots and lines for these patterns is pulling my own rod. I've noticed often having rods that have been shipped, there's a little bit of scratching that'll happen, and even just kicking around the shop, collecting dust and stuff like that. Every so often there's a little bit of an imperfection that gets kind of trapped into the pattern. So I've started taking a thicker rod and pulling down rod from 16mm or 1-inch rod. And this gives me a chance to skin the outer wall, and then that lets me reveal pristine, clean, new glass that hasn't had anything rubbing up against it. And when you pull those down, you can kind of pick how thick you want that rod to be. So I was actually shooting for somewhere in between that 3 and 7mm rod, probably going for somewhere around 4.5, 5mm was what I was landing at on a few of them, and having that size rod's really nice. So there you can see some of the pattern, some of that color starting to come out, that blue. Grabbing another section, there we got the chromium now, and we're going to repeat that process. So these were just the last 2 implosions I had to do before I could finish the piece. I was almost done all the prep, but I wanted to get the live going, so there was still a couple pieces to make, and I figured it'd be nice to throw the implosions into the mix as well. So there you can see I'm heating up the end. Once again, we're trying to go for that nice thin bubble, and like this tubing was sleeved in clear 2 or 3 times at least. Gives a nice thick layer of color or clear on top for us to draw this pattern into, and then as it displaces the color underneath, it really looks good. The chromium was gathered up from a single rod and then blown out, so sleeving it again and again also really stretches out any patterns or kind of inconsistencies in the color and starts to really give you that fine, consistent look to that shiny metallic green. It's very much like a candy apple green. This stuff is the warm variant. It was an off-color batch that I managed to scoop when Molten Aura posted it up. So I don't know quite what the difference between the warm variant and regular chromium is for aesthetic purposes, but I'm pretty happy with the way this stuff looks, and it works absolutely amazingly. And like I said, I managed to sleeve this single rod blowout in 2 or 3 layers of clear. I've done the same with Neptunium and Electrum, and all these colors can really stretch without losing their saturation. And we got the pattern mostly done, and we're heating it up. I'm gonna puff that out now. Watch that expand. And getting that pattern to sink in like that, part of the process really is puffing until that pattern starts to stretch the clear that you've put on the outside. So what I'll often do is puff a little bit when it's really hot so that the thinnest parts stretch, and then I'll pause so that those parts start to cool a little bit, and then puff again so that the thicker sections that are still molten have a chance to stretch the color underneath all the dots and lines, and then recondense until the walls even out. Really, that gives you that pattern. So once again, we're gonna handle up to that real quick, tear that away in the flame, and we'll actually seal it shut, and I'll pick the hole open with a rod, just like I did on the other half. But as I do this, I'm gonna stretch out that connection point a little bit and puff into it a little, and that'll thin the glass a bit and give me a good spot to tear away in the flame and a thin membrane to pick open. There we go with that puff, and I do that a couple times, give it a real good stretch and a little puff there. So that's a pretty thin spot that I can pick open in the flame really easily. Use the octagonal reamer to open it up, and we're gonna handle up to this bubble with a blow tube. So this is gonna be the first piece of the bowl half of the piece. So it's actually gonna be the bottom, and then we'll stack a section of fume, and then another section of chromium on top of that, and then a final section of fume to sink in so that the chromium pattern doesn't end up hidden inside the bowl. So I'm ready to go, getting that connection point nice and hot, puffing it out to even out any walls. Condensing it back and making sure we got a nice straight handle on there. Just knock that temporary handle away. Now we're gonna just use the marver a little bit to even it out and make sure it's nice and straight and not bobbing on the axis of the turn. Now opening up that center so we can prepare it for the next bubble. See that stretch out a little bit, and once you've got a nice thin membrane, when you're picking holes open, you really want to try and keep the ring that you're trying to open up outside of the flame and pull the thin glass into the flame with the rod, and really open up holes quickly like that. We got another little stringer of galaxy, and we'll push that on that lip. So a quick even turn. Yeah, then we take a little reamer and push the little bubble of glass that, or a little hump that is always there when you flame cut the rod away. Going back and forth between the side of the L-marver, flattening that ring, and then using the reamer to open it up again just helps keep a nice, even, consistent ring. And trying to make sure it's right on center too. Just matching up those two sized holes to the same diameter so that we don't have to smush that lip wrap that we made. And as we work these parts in, we always want to focus on the smallest section. The thinnest part of the hourglass in between these two bubbles is the part you want to focus the most heat on, and you really want to try and condense some glass into that space. So you are pushing together ever so slightly, but not enough to really deform the tube. And that gives you glass that you can puff out and maintain the wall thickness. There we go. Grab another bubble with the chromium patterns after we pop this hole open. This type of piece is a little bit repetitive on the stacking. Just open a hole up, wrap that lip with some color, match the two holes so the ring seal can work in nicely, then heat it up, puff it out over and over. And pulling these stringers nice and even and straight is quite helpful to putting those lip wraps on consistently, because you really want to make a fine, straight black line. Any inconsistency to your stringers can really affect that. There's the section that'll end up being the shoulder of the bowl. I'm really happy how the pattern actually lined up on that section. It really made these cool waves once the piece is finished that I'm really happy with. Making these inconsistent patterns really gives you some kind of natural variation to how everything turns out. Instead of doing the same pattern over and over, it's nice to see things kind of develop organically that way. So since this is going to be the top side of the bowl, we're going to start to actually condense a little more glass and puff out a bubble a little larger. Now we're going to get ready to add that final section of glass just so that the chromium pattern doesn't get hidden at the end. Yeah, just trying to always heat and make sure you got some nice even-sized walls. Warming up an even section, always a little bit more than you want to move, so that the glass next to where you want the glass to expand can kind of grow ever so slightly to accommodate the larger bubble that you're making. Just pick that open again, reamer real quick, paddle. Kind of bring that lip back in sometimes if it's a little wobbly. Just always trying to make a nice even ring to put these lip wraps onto so you can open it up even. The more even everything is, the more it expands evenly and you don't get those waves and oddness developing in the line. It's nice to get a peek at that pattern. The bottom side's starting to cool off a little bit too, so you can see the color a bit. And this last section of silver fumed glass is actually the only piece that didn't have any pattern to it, just because it was going to be underneath the bowl. It was not anything I wanted to draw any more patterns into. It gave me a little bit of glass to color at least though. So once things get a little dark, you'll be able to see the color of the silver fume a little bit. There we go. Making a little constriction, giving us a place to focus that flame so we can flame cut it and not expand or stretch too much of the other tube into it. Now, I got that handle away quick because at this point it's not a big bubble that's going to flop around too much, so it won't affect the lip wrap, and I don't want any twisting to go on, so just using gravity to cook that back and heat to bring the glass in is all you need. When you're building the other parts, it's really important to have like 2 handles on if it's a bit of a larger section, but once you have a smaller piece being melted into a larger bubble, it's a lot easier to do it with only 1 handle. And we got a nice even bubble, and we're gonna start to heat that up and really try to get the finished diameter blown out here. So I'm gonna kind of tap with the paddle there. And the reason I'm not just pushing is because I don't want to rotate and twist the bowl at all. I want that tapping to kind of chill that top and stop it from expanding and force the glass in a little and puff in between so that I can expand it without, like I said, twisting anything. So that friction against the marver can kind of pull the glass if everything's too hot. That expanded to a nice shoulder. You can see it's looking great. Now we're going to get ready for that carb. We're going to blow out a little bit of a blister here, and then I'm going to take a section of 10 mil rod, heat up a nice hot gather. See that blister there? And we're going to glob that hot gather over that blister and puff into it. So this allows us to tubulate that solid rod to make a raised carb. I've always loved the way a raised carb looks on a piece. It's a little bit more than just popping a hole. So aesthetically pleasing and nice for the way your thumb sits on it when you're using it. So I picked up my sharp flame hand torch. Just gonna work in that connection point. Just the way the globbing and puffing into that bubble goes, sometimes there's a little bit of a thin spot right at the connection, but it doesn't take too much time to heat that up and condense glass into that space. Just trying to get it evenly hot, puff it out a little bit. That raised carb also serves another purpose. So now that we've got the 2 halves of the pipe built, we're gonna actually have to bridge these together to work in the ring seal where they meet. And that raised carb becomes an ideal bridging point. So now I'm just really kind of trying to judge the angle that I want to put these together. That's why I was holding them up and inspecting everything. And I'm going to pop that hole right where I want to get the right lean on that end of the piece. And I'm trying to open up the U shape a little bit, so I don't want that bubble too high up, because it can often be a spot where there's a lot of extra glass that condenses inside in between the 2 halves of the pipe. So now we're using the reamer to kind of open up that hole, make sure it's nice and even. Kind of, yeah. Looking down on it, see you've got a nice round hole there. And the goal with doing these ring seals is to have an even-sized hole on each piece, so that when you put them together, there's no oddness. Often when I was listening to Mike Mason explain this process, he said this, I think it was 40-40-20 rule, where 40% of your work should be setting up this hole, making sure the 2 rings are the same size, and then 40% of the work is sticking them together, and then at the very end, that last step, that 20% of the work should be left. And any amount of work that you don't do by making a mistake or kind of cutting corners will be transferred to the next step. So if you try and stick these together and the holes weren't set up evenly, any amount of work that you didn't do to set up those even holes gets transferred to the next step. So that 40 on the second step becomes 50 or 60% of the work. And then if you miss another 20% of the work at the end, instead of having that last 20 being just melting everything in, you end up with 40-50% of the work on the step that should have been easy and quick. And there you see I've added the bridging point to the blow tube. It's gonna give me that spot to put a solid rod so I can keep everything stationary while I work it in. There we are judging them up, and I was pretty happy with how those lined up. I wouldn't say I did a perfect 40% of the work on doing the stick here. There was a little bit of oddness, I spent some time here judging the straightness and kind of adjusting and kind of making sure everything's lined up the way I want before I finally get around to putting that bridge together. This is the time where you really want to take your time and make sure that's straight and judge it against the bowl and look down the mouthpiece and see if everything lines up, because if you don't fix it here and you make your bridge and melt everything in, there's pretty much no other chances to fix it. It's only when you have two handles on it where you can do that. So I really keep that pretty hot, straighten it out. Now we'll pick up a rod right after I tear away a little bit of this extra glass. But I do take a moment to flash that ring seal a little bit and give it a puff before I put the bridge on. So I bridge up to the carb to begin with. I'll get that ripping hot and then bend it immediately so it can start to join with the other bridging point. I heat the end and then push the side of that rod into that. And I really make sure I cook in this seal before I move on. So I don't want any glass to want to break, and then I go straight back to that ring seal before I do anything else with that bridge so that I can make sure that's nice and hot and not going to crack. So until all those odd little acute angles are worked in, there's definitely potential for that part to crack and you can lose the whole piece if you're not careful and let things get too cold. So there I go, back to the bridge just to make sure it's nice and happy before I finish that ring seal. The whole process is just making sure that the parts that are maybe a little bit iffy and could crack, if there's any, temper differential, or you accidentally flash something that's stressed out, you really don't want to let anything break on that bridge right now, because you're going to get that U bend completely hot, and if it breaks, you end up having that whole half of the pipe start to tilt and fall with gravity. But if you keep all that glass nice and hot, everything will be happy and you won't lose it. So working in this seal, you really want to start from the thinnest point. You want to start with a small flame and start to expand the thinnest part until it gets closer to the rest of the walls, and then you can start to heat up a larger and larger area. And you're really trying to use gravity to make sure it doesn't fall into an odd spot. And I'll often use some heat on just one half and let the rest of the glass all fall towards the ring seal from either side separately. And I'll use gravity to bring that glass towards the ring seal, just to thicken it up. Because when you start with a smaller ring and then puff it out large, it'll thin if you don't try to bring glass from around it to that point. And the whole process of moving glass from one place to where you want it to go is to heat the glass you want to move and then heat the place you want it to go. And gravity and puffing and pushing and pulling is how we get that done. So there you can see that U-bend's really started to even out. It's looking pretty good. Now we can get rid of that bridge. So I just heat up a section, rip it out with my tweezers, and then I'll grab my tongs and just heat that until it starts to fall away, and then rip it off in the flame. So once we've got that off of there, everything's looking pretty good. Now we just have a bowl hole to pop. We've got to open up that carb, clean it up, and it'll be done. So I think we're going to get started by heating up that whole carb. I'm really trying to get it all hot and give it a nice kind of unifying puff. And then always watching it, looking at it, trying to judge which way you could use gravity to make it fall into the place you want it. And now we're going to puff out a little blister on that bowl hole. Now we're popping it. We're kind of going back in and out of the flame to really puff out a thin blister. Now I've got that hole open, so I use the paddle to kind of force it back down. Now I've got my bowl push in the hands, and There we go, pushing that bowl hole. I really try to get the whole top of that piece hot, and that'll give you enough glass to push it in. Use that octagonal reamer to just push the point into the bowl hole and kind of reposition it a little, and then kind of evening out the shape of the bowl with the bowl push again. Now I'm kind of flame polishing the interior of the bowl. There you see the finished piece. Actually, the live stream cut off a little early, so I get this bowl hole, or sorry, the carb popped open, and I start to ream it out, but the live stream did cut off before I got a chance to finish it up completely. But there wasn't really anything else. I pretty much go to showing it to the camera after that. So here's the finished piece. You can see that nice silver fume looking nice and blue in the midsection, and all that chromium looks excellent. I really love this color. The warm variant's got a really nice green hue, and these waves that I was talking about earlier in the edge of the bowl are one of my favorite parts of the whole piece. Some nice colors and patterns in there. Yeah, you can see the waves there and that swirl at the end. Can't wait to make some more of these. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you have any other questions. I'd love to hear them. I'll try and cover them in another upload in the future. Let me know if you liked the format of this upload. Thanks for watching.